again, and thanks for joining us for lunch. Fake news, no collusion, Spygate are just some of the issues that have become ingrained in so many discussions during the Trump presidency. To delve deeper in what it's like working in the U.S. and fighting for the First Amendment protection, please welcome our international representative, Fiona Conway.
Thank you, Ian. We're really thrilled that we have Dan Shelley, the Executive Director of RTDNA USA, and Scott Libin, who is the Chairman of RTDNA USA. And it's really impressive that they came up here because it's a long weekend in the U.S. and I'm sure that they'd like to be enjoying the beach right now. But thank you so much for coming. It's a really important time right now in the U.S. to be talking about the First Amendment, what it's like to be a reporter in the era of Trump and the era of fake news. So I invited them to come and share the challenges that journalists are experiencing right now, but also what the RTDNA is doing, working with journalists to ensure the protection of journalists and the protection of the First Amendment. So I wanted this to be a conversation. I'm going to start it off with a few areas to talk about, but I hope that you'll join the conversation. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about what it's like today being a journalist in America. So starting with Dan, the Voice of the First Amendment is a very important initiative of RTDNA. So can you talk a little bit about what it means and how you're working with the public and journalists?
Sure. RTDNA in the United States started its Voice of the First Amendment Task Force in early 2017 after we were approached by the corporate executives of several local media companies that run mostly television stations and TV news operations throughout the United States, who said, hey, we need some help. We find that this most dishonest people in the room effect that had become so prevalent during the 2016 presidential campaign was starting to filter down to the local level in communities red, blue, and purple all across the United States. And these media executives were telling us, we have photographers who are being harassed. We have journalists who are being threatened. We have employees who are being encountered by angry people calling them purveyors of fake news and enemies of the American people. And we need an organization, and RTDNA seems the perfect one, to stand up for us and our rights as we endeavor every single day at the local level to keep communities informed and to fulfill our constitutionally guaranteed obligation to speak truth to power and to reveal what's going on in communities all over the country.
And could I just interject by
Absolutely.
saying the launching of our Voice of the First Amendment Task Force coincided with the beginning of Dan's tenure as our executive director. That's not coincidence, but I have to say that Dan's entry, and Dan is a longtime board member, been associated with us for decades now. But Dan's leadership in this role really has invigorated and energized and given a very powerful voice to this at a time that's obviously been pivotal, not just for our association or our craft, but I believe certainly for our country and for journalists everywhere who recognize that we need to tell our story more powerfully, more effectively, and I think more assertively. So that's been a huge part of this past year or so. It's really moved RTDNA from an organization that I don't think was always as vocal as it needed to be to one that now has a place in a really critical conversation.
One of the things is also informing the public about what a journalist's role is. You're doing that.
Our Voice of the First Amendment Task Force has a bifurcated mission. First is to defend against any and all perceived attacks to the First Amendment and press freedom. And as Scott noted, thank you very much for your kind words, we are very aggressive at doing that at the federal level, also at the state and even local levels. The second part of that mission is to help the public better understand why what we call outstanding responsible journalism is essential to their daily lives.
I think that this story that I'm about to get you to talk more about is a really good example of what is going on and the really great work that Dan and Scott are doing. T-shirt for sale on Amazon, and what it says on the T-shirt is rope, tree, journalist, some assembly required.
This was a T-shirt that someone had spotted at a Trump campaign rally about a week or two before the 2016 election in Minneapolis, by the way.
Proud moment for Minnesota.
Yeah. And a Reuters photographer had circulated it via social media, and it just kind of sat there. And as I was, I don't know what prompted me late last summer to do a simple Google search on rope tree journalist. But all of a sudden it came up on Walmart's e-commerce site, the world's largest retailer. So I immediately contacted Walmart, the CEO and their e-commerce platform head, and requested that they remove this T-shirt, because while we believe in the First Amendment, obviously, we're fierce defenders of the First Amendment, there are limits to free speech, and one of those limits is the open advocacy of violence against a group of people, in this case journalists. So within 8 hours, Walmart had removed the T-shirt from its e-commerce site. The next morning, I did another Google search, and there it was on Amazon. So I reached out to Jeff Bezos, who, as you probably know, in addition to running Amazon, owns the Washington Post. And within 4 hours, it had been removed from Amazon.com. The next morning, I Googled again, and there it was on eBay. And by this point, our efforts had gotten some attention in the press in the United States. And so the vendor who had posted it on eBay actually said in his post, "Banned by Walmart, so we made copies." So I reached out to the top executives at eBay, and I think within 1 hour, it had been removed from eBay. We did that for the reasons I just described, but we did not do that without considerable thought about the whole conundrum of, well, we're first and foremost a First Amendment advocacy organization, and people are and companies are very well within their First Amendment rights to make, sell, purchase, and wear these T-shirts, and there were hats as well, and coffee mugs and other tchotchkes. So, you know, is it the right thing for a First Amendment group to do to try to squelch speech that we find offensive? And we ultimately decided, with Scott's help, and Scott, for those of you who don't know, is a very well-known media ethicist in the United States. So we're fortunate at this time in our history to have him as the chairman of our board of directors. There wasn't much discussion or debate. I mean, your thought pretty much was, yeah, we kind of have an obligation to speak out here.
It was, but we did anticipate some challenges. You know, in the United States, people are very fond of invoking the First Amendment, not so fond of studying it. And there are people who don't really understand what the First Amendment says and what it doesn't say. It says Congress shall make no law abridging 5 particular freedoms. The courts have interpreted that to mean the government in a larger sense, not just Congress. But it doesn't say you can say anything to anybody anytime with no consequences. And yet, here we were asking these organizations to pull some merchandise that, you know, conceivably could have been defended as an exercise of political speech. We didn't say the government should step in. We didn't say there ought to be a law, this ought to be illegal. We said you have every right to market this kind of rhetoric if you choose to. Is that really who you want to be? We hope it's not. We think that it's dangerous. We think that while you might excuse it as some form of irony or satire, that there are too many people in our country, and I think there's powerful evidence of this in the last couple of years, who don't recognize absurdity when they see it, and take it quite literally. So we did get a little pushback.
We did.
And we were ready for that, and I think that's a consequence of our action. I think we have to be ready for that. But we don't feel, as an association, that we can't speak up because anything anybody says anytime has got to be okay with us. There ought to be consequences for speech. We just don't think the government ought to be the one restricting it, except in the narrowest and most exceptional of circumstances.
And to their credit, Walmart and Amazon, I'm convinced, had no idea that these shirts were being offered on their e-commerce platforms, because they came in through APIs through contracts they have with vendors. And it was the vendors who were selling the T-shirts through Walmart.com and Amazon.com. But that's no excuse. I mean, as soon as we called it to their attention, they did remove the shirts, and I felt pretty good about that.
The response was really swift, and as you said, it accelerated. It's possible that we actually gave some unintended promotion to this piece of merchandise. Frankly, I think sales might have spiked a little before, this thing was withdrawn. But again, we didn't do this without some thought and some collaboration and some conversation.
But I must admit, I savored the victory a little bit, particularly when a couple of weeks later it showed up on Snopes.com as being a fact that the Radio Television Digital News Association had compelled the world's largest retailer, aka Walmart, to remove these T-shirts from its e-commerce platform.
But what that T-shirt speaks to is the atmosphere in the United States right now towards journalism, towards facts, truth. And I think it wasn't like perfect before, but talk a little bit about what the Trump era has done to having to be a journalist, how you conduct your work, the kind of threats, assaults, the tone. What has it done, and how, compared to how it was, say, 2.5, 3 years ago?
Can I just say, those last 3 sessions were really uplifting, and I want to apologize in advance for the buzzkill that we're providing here. I mean, there is hope, but it is serious. You're absolutely
I want
right.
one of those VR.
Yeah,
things, so
because reality these days is a little tough.
This is a little scary.
Yeah.
Well, in 2017, we were approached by the Committee to Protect Journalists and asked to partner with them on a new project called the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. And it has since become the archive of record for attacks and other threats to press freedom in the United States. And that was really novel, because prior to that, the Committee to Protect Journalists was a global organization that monitored attacks on journalists and journalism in third world countries, and would issue annual reports about all the deaths in the Middle East, or all the deaths in the Philippines, or all the deaths of journalists in the most dangerous places in the world. And they suddenly felt compelled to start chronicling threats against journalists in the United States. And I will tell you, according to that U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, of which we are a founding partner with the Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations, in 2017 alone, there were 45 physical attacks on journalists across the United States, and 34 arrests of journalists across the United States, most of which occurred during incidents of civil unrest. Prior to that, there are no records. We can't tell you how many assaults on journalists and attacks on press freedom there were, because nobody was chronicling it the way we are now with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker.
And that leads to me the next question, which was one of the issues that's going on is kettling, which you wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah,
and explain what kettling means.
Yeah, most of the arrests that occurred in 2017 in the United States, arrests of journalists, occurred during incidents of civil unrest. Protests in St. Louis, in in St. Louis, in Charlottesville, even in some very liberal communities such as Berkeley, California, where there would be moments of civil unrest, and police would literally surround the group of protesters, kettling them in within a perimeter. And more often than not, there would be a few journalists who were covering the civil unrest caught in that kettle. Officers would then order them to disperse or face arrest, but they had nowhere to go because they were surrounded. And that accounted for a significant number of the 34 arrests of journalists, plus hundreds, if not thousands, of other Americans during these moments. It happened in Minneapolis as well after the Philando Castillo verdict. Finally, at the urging of RTDNA and other press freedom groups, a federal judge in St. Louis said to the St. Louis Police Department, you may no longer employ this tactic of kettling. And what would happen in St. Louis in particular, if I could take just a second to talk about it, is the police would surround a group of protesters, often catching journalists in their web, would order them to disperse. They'd have no place to go, so they'd be placed under arrest, but not just placed under arrest. There were several cases of journalists that were handcuffed, thrown to the ground, and then officers would stomp on their head and pepper spray them in the eyes from about a 2 feet or 3 feet distance. And the federal judge specifically prohibited the St. Louis Police Department from continuing that practice. So a small victory nonetheless, but there are still lawsuits pending against the St. Louis Police Department by individual journalists who were subjected to that treatment.
Those are extreme cases. An extraordinary photojournalist who worked for me when I was a news director in 2008, and the Republican convention was in St. Paul. This man was arrested in a move very much like that. This has been 10 years ago, covering protests at the Republican convention. Swept up onto an overpass and told to disperse, where your options are limited, and then arrested. But the violence that you've just described didn't occur. He was released after a while, and this has been really just a story of escalation of that sort of police tactic. But some of the arrests have not involved civil disturbance, civil disruption, or group arrests. We spoke at our last convention with a journalist in West Virginia who was arrested for shouting questions at a member of the administration's cabinet, at a Trump administration official who was there at the state capitol in his public capacity to testify and for meetings. And this was in the hallway, literally the corridor of the state legislature. And it took months to clear that case. These are not simply harassment techniques that slow people down and cause them to miss deadline, though they do that. In some cases, they become expensive, protracted legal procedures.
I have been told that the networks, and I don't know if you know about this or are involved, have actually reached out to the White House and asked for the president to dial it back because somebody's going to get hurt.
Still waiting for that response.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the networks have also taken great steps to protect the security of their correspondents and their field crews. Many of the networks, anytime they're sending a crew into an event where there's even the slightest fear that there might be a disturbance or violence, hire armed guards, in many cases retired Secret Service agents, to protect their crews. In fact, at our Excellence in Journalism conference in Los Angeles last September, one of our speakers was Jake Tapper from CNN. And he showed up at a journalists' conference with 2 retired Secret Service agents, armed guards, to protect him while he was there. And that I was astounded by that at first, but then comforted by that, because it told me that CNN, and there are other national media companies in the States as well who do this, I think Fox News is the only one that doesn't, who are protecting their people and trying to avert any danger to them.
Katie Tur with NBC, who was on the campaign with Trump, and he would call her out and point at her. And the crowd, she actually took video of the crowd turning on her, and she had to have security for much of the campaign.
I have to say, as a television news director, I took very seriously the risks that our crews took on a daily basis, but I didn't worry about their personal safety sending them to political rallies or campaign events. That was never in the past, in my view, hazardous duty. And that really has changed since the 2016 campaign. And those stories from Katie Tur and others are chilling. And I don't know what it's like to have a crowd turn on you when you're corralled in at the back of the room and have somebody exhorting these people to, to harangue you and maybe worse. It isn't always violence. As recently as this week, I think many of you will have heard that the Trump administration at an event that was supposedly open to the media excluded certain representatives of organizations the president had criticized. We're hearing again a Nixonian expression. There was plausible deniability to this because they said, well, we had only so many seats, but those in the room said, really, there were plenty of open chairs.
This is the EPA.
Yeah,
Yes.
EPA, where, as you know, the administrator has 24-hour-a-day security and has from day one, a story in itself. So, yes, it's been an extraordinary time, and we really don't know where it goes from here.
So I'd like to open it up to the floor. Are there any questions? Scott.
Follow the bouncing cube.
Oh, yeah, where's the... I
Now,
love
Scott
this.
wants to see the cube fly through the
toss
air.
that thing. I go to a lot of these, and I got to give you credit. I've never seen this device employed before. Well, pressure's on you because it's coming your way.
You got to throw it, Kim.
Go, Kim. Yeah, or someone's food.
The slogan I liked was "Make America Think Again." I just wonder if all of this, if there's a positive in it.
Raise the cube a little.
If there's a positive in it in some degree that all of this fake news has made news directors re-examine their own policies, their own ethics, their own way of reporting to make it less fake, to make it more honest, to give it more integrity.
We should get to the very terminology of fake news at some point, but I want to be more responsive to your question because I do think, while this is not the way I would have chosen, or any of us I think would have chosen, I do think we have an opportunity here to engage in some introspection and ask why this rhetoric sells and is as accepted as it is by so many people in our country. I do think that we as journalists at times have been guilty of arrogance. When I got into this business many, many years ago, my journalism professors taught me that news is what editors say it is. And those people out there you serve, they don't really know what's in their best interest. They can take their business elsewhere if they don't like what you determine is good for them. Well, the dirty little secret was there weren't that many places to go at that time. They didn't have that many options. So there was some arrogance, and I think that led us to feel we had unique powers. I think we're over that. I don't think it requires the level of vilification and demonization that our president practices on a daily basis now. But our response can't be simply self-pity and defensiveness. I do think we have to be better. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We ought to be accountable. We talk about holding the powerful accountable, and frankly, journalism organizations, especially major media organizations, are still quite powerful and ought to be held to a high standard. So it's not that we are blameless in every respect and that we can't improve. I don't think this has been the healthiest process so far, but there may be some byproducts of it that are good for us.
And whenever I travel around America, I always ask journalists these questions. Are you exposing problems in your communities and then following up with stories that offer solutions? I think that's very important. Do you find ways to speak to the public off air about not just what you report, but the process you go through to report it? Do you share the ethical dilemmas that you face on a regular basis and how you go about debating and deciding those questions in your newsroom during the news gathering and reporting process? And do your station's top executives do on-air editorials and public speeches explaining your news gathering philosophy? Those questions are all geared toward encouraging a higher level of transparency in what newsrooms are doing across the country and sharing with the public in a more articulate way and a more expansive way precisely the issues that they debate every single day and how they, and it can be as simple as in a story about corruption at City Hall, when the reporter in the story says, we attempted to call the mayor 20 times to get his reaction. Actually showing the reporter on the phone calling City Hall instead of just saying that. Little things like that and bigger things like explaining how you deal with ethical dilemmas and the angst and the debate and the discussion that go on to help you reach those decisions, and then following up with perhaps an online or some other explanation to the public as to how you resolve those dilemmas.
And I think that kind of transparency forces us to raise our standards. By the way, I think that transparency is a set of skills, right? Everybody's for it in theory, but you find it's not as simple in the execution sometimes. So, in addition to showing that reporter trying to call City Hall, I like it when I hear news organizations say, we started trying to get a response 5 days ago, so that we know it wasn't 5 minutes before air or publication, but we placed, several calls we began several days ago. I think if we hold ourselves to those higher standards, we'll be more comfortable telling people what we've done, because it's never been terribly satisfying for me as a viewer to hear that, we tried to get a response, we couldn't get one. Well, you know what, if you called 5 minutes ago and they haven't had a chance to formulate that response and get it back to you, that might not be quite fair in my view. We need to get better at some of that stuff.
Lessons learned for Ontario in the next month, I would say.
Yeah.
Preemptively.
So I hear.
Scott, right across the
table. It's a short toss. There you go.
We're seeing that political conversation is becoming increasingly polarized and increasingly segregated in this echo chamber model of media consumption. So I'm wondering, to what degree do you see value, and in what ways do you see opportunity for journalists and other kinds of storytellers to reach outside of our usual tribes?
Oh, I think that's essential. Not only journalists, but members of the public need to do that, and we need to help them understand why it's important to do that. You're right, there are so many tribes, and there is new research out that shows this divide in America has never been starker than it is right now, and more pronounced. And there are several things you could do about that, but one of the most important is for you to start individually in making a conscious effort to see what the other side is saying. If you're in the States, if you're a CNN, you need to constantly monitor what Fox News is doing, and vice versa, to see what the other side of that echo chamber is doing, and to make sure that you are reporting as responsibly as possible, and calling out their errors, because they're sure as hell going to call out what they perceive to be yours.
As this morning's sessions demonstrated, technology has enabled us to do amazing things and continues to expand our horizons. But it has also made it easier to protect ourselves. Obviously, it's never been as simple to shield yourself from opposing opinion. You can be bombarded with information all day long and really never encounter anything that forces you to think if you filter it all out. That's a tough sell to say to people, you need to expose yourself to people who disagree. And the premise has to be that disagreement doesn't equal, somebody who disagrees with you is not necessarily evil or corrupt or stupid. And in our country, sadly, these days, too many people have redefined trust, for example, as, well, that's about people who agree with me. This is one of the, I think, higher hurdles that we face, but I think it's really critical. We don't have the kind of conversations as often anymore that we used to, where people of good faith, reasonable people, can disagree but learn from each other. And that's a little scary to me.
Anybody else? Right behind you, if you could
that
throw
one's
it over
closest.
Very interesting description of the deterioration surrounding the physical security of journalists in the U.S. To what extent is that simply a Trump problem, or are there deeper structural issues at play there?
Trump was very effective at giving a strong, powerful voice to a feeling that had sort of been an undercurrent in America for many, many years. This didn't just start with Trump, but this is a trend that he recognized was there below the surface and exploited to his gain, and frankly, many believe to the loss of civility in the United States. You know, in the 1960s, during the Goldwater campaign, there was a large, it was a minority of Americans, but a significant minority that Richard Nixon would later call the silent majority, who didn't like what they were hearing from CBS, NBC, ABC News, or reading in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. And they were very vocal about it, but they didn't know how to voice those concerns. And then you had the advent of the Rush Limbaughs of the world, followed by Fox News and other conservative outlets. Now you have Breitbart, InfoWars, and a whole new generation of alternative media who believe that they are the only purveyors of the truth. And unfortunately, their most ardent fans believe that to be true, and most ardent consumers believe that to be true. So Trump tapped into a vein that was in that gold mine, but had yet to be fully exploited. And you know, to his credit, it's working to a large degree, which is great job security for me.
Any other questions?
There's some over here, I think.
I guess something that I've been thinking about is how do you reach those people that are only consuming Fox News, only consuming Breitbart? You know, clearly it seems that facts don't matter if they're not coming from their own preferred source. Like, how do you reach those people in such a way that say, you know, look, whatever your political alliances are, whatever you may believe to be true, how do you get through to those people that here are the actual facts when facts are, you know, whatever Trump apparently says they are? How do you you know, bridge that gap?
I'm going to leave the Breitbarts and InfoWars to Dan, but I will say, and I don't know that I've ever done this before, I want to say a word in defense of Fox News publicly here. You know, Fox News has its flamethrowers and its opinion purveyors, but it also has some serious journalists. And you actually can learn and educate yourself, I think, from watching Fox News Channel. I worry much more about this sort of, what do they call that, the fever swamp of, you know, people who are just foaming at the mouth and feeding on each other. I don't know how to motivate that community to expand its horizons and open its mind. That's a tough one. I fervently hope that there just aren't enough people caught exclusively in that, that they can continue to steer our national conversation.
I think there's a tremendous opportunity here because in the United States, there are empirical data that show that people trust their local news providers significantly more than they trust national and international news providers. I'm sure you've heard this saying in America that everybody hates Congress, but they love their own congressman. And the same can be said about their local TV station or newspaper or radio station. Everybody loves Jack Smith, who gives them their local news on Channel 10 at 11 o'clock. But when you ask them, what do you think of the news media? Oh, I hate those corrupt bastards. So if there is a glimmer of hope, it is that local journalism is still held in higher esteem than the national news media. But you know, cracking that national perception of national news media nut is going to be much harder over a longer period of time.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that.
It's a long
Come on,
toss.
throw it.
Go ahead. Oh, come on.
Like a javelin.
Just to follow up on that, on the perception of national media, we had a lot of discussion, including yesterday, as you well know, on you know, CNN and whether or not the divisiveness is backfiring, you know, and the constant reminder of the truth and the course, you know, and the fact checking and you know, the apple and orange campaign or banana campaign, if that's not having actually a harmful effect on the news media, because it doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that campaign. I don't know if it's time to tally up the final results yet. You know, and I probably haven't seen every spot often enough, and I'm no expert in strategic communication, which is really what that is, by the way. I mean, let's face it, that's not journalism, that's strategic communication. That's trying to get a message to people, and we practice that as well, trying to get them to recognize that there really is still such a thing as objective truth. There's a lot of subjectivity, but some things are true, and no matter how often somebody says they aren't, they remain true. I'm not ready to give up on that yet, but I think part of what we see, and I'm a fan of CNN, but I recognize that CNN itself has occasionally taken some brief side trips off that middle-of-the-road approach that it used to take. Some of its hosts are a little bit more provocative and offer a little bit more opinion than they used to, and I don't have the answer to that, but I think I don't think it's over. I don't see evidence that it's actually backfiring. I appreciate the assertion of certain really abiding truths by news organizations like CNN.
Well, let me just say that that's not the only campaign that a cable network is doing. MSNBC has a campaign going now where they use the audio of speeches from former presidents, from former giants of the U.S. Broadcast journalism industry, talking about the high standards and high value and high necessity for journalism, over which they show images of first their correspondents and then their opinion hosts. And that concerns me. This is not a criticism of MSNBC, it's a criticism of a particular campaign that they're running at the moment. That exacerbates one of the biggest problems, which is the conflation by many of opinion journalism or opinion media and traditional journalism. And when you put in the same promo over the voice of Chet Huntley, the late, great former NBC news anchor, talking about how great journalism is and how essential it is to America, when you superimpose over his words, first an image of Katie Tur, who is a journalist, and then an image of Rachel Maddow right after her, who is an opinion host, that contributes to the confusion and the conflation, in my personal opinion. It doesn't help. And so as moving and as well done as those promos are, I think they're adding to the confusion and the conflation instead of helping clearly identify the difference between opinion media and honest-to-God journalism.
Well, they don't do, I think that that's a really good point, and they should be more transparent that this is opinion. You know, when the latest flap that occurred with Sean Hannity, he was on some networks being called a journalist, on others not. He's a talk show host. But I think that all of us should be clear about what everybody's job is, because the lines are so blurred right now. I think it's really problematic.
Yeah, so let me ask this group, since we're talking about promotion, about the Sinclair campaign, the fake news spot. We wouldn't have gotten this far into a conversation like this in the United States probably without that coming up.
First question.
Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Sinclair's television station? Some of you are nodding, but some shaking.
They had all their anchors. It's a must read, so you get copy, and every station they have to read this one particular.
Sinclair, by way of background, is the largest owner of television stations in the United States and about to get much bigger if it successfully completes an acquisition of Tribune. It's going to spin off some stations, but it's going to approach a reach of somewhere upwards of 60%. It would have been 72% of the American television audience would have theoretically been within the range of a Sinclair television station until it announced that it would spin off some of these stations. Sinclair did a promo recently, a must-run, scripted at the corporate office, provided to every one of its stations that does news, where local anchors, those trusted, familiar faces and voices Dan referred to, all read verbatim the same script. And it warned against fake news. And one of the problems I believe it had was that it conflated news and social media content that I wouldn't define as news. It also echoed the president's vilification of journalism, and it offended a lot of people in our industry because it was executed in a heavy-handed way. It was written, scripted centrally, and the local stations had no choice in this matter. It was out there for a couple of months before Deadspin did a mashup showing about 64 anchors at one time reading the same script verbatim.
If you haven't seen it, it's worth going and looking at.
Yeah. It's been a very controversial thing for us. We've been asked about it a lot. One of the things that complicates it is it's hard to find anything in the actual message that you would actively disagree with, right? Nobody's in favor of fake news. I don't know, raise your hand if you're in favor of fake news, right? And it even ends with a call to action saying, hey, if you ever catch us, doing something you think is unethical or inaccurate, we want to know about it, right? That's laudable. But these other elements of it made it very off-putting and very objectionable to a lot of people in our industry. And to me, the worst part of it is this sense that anything that is flawed, I make a distinction between flawed news and fake news. There are a lot of things that can go wrong with news. Everybody in this room knows it. Reporting can be incomplete. It can be inaccurate. It can even be biased, and none of those things is good. But to me, that's not the same thing as fake news. Right. Now, our president has redefined that term to mean anything and anybody who offends him, and that's a lot of ground to cover. But to me, fake news is Pizzagate or the papal endorsement of Donald Trump when he was running for president. These are what we used to call hoaxes that simply travel at the speed of light these days because of social media. And we don't really know the long-term impact of this campaign by these Sinclair stations. I think there's going to be a ripple effect that continues. But boy, it got a lot of attention, and even outside of our industry. The first non-journalist to ask me about it was my dental hygienist, and I knew this thing had really traveled. By the way, of course, my mouth was full of sharp implements when she asked me for my opinion. It's always a lopsided conversation.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, both of you. We've really enjoyed having you.
Can I just say thank you for inviting us and for letting a guy from Minnesota provide the view from the south. That's a first for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And we really do appreciate your participation and your support of RTDNA Canada. Thank you.
Well, you guys are great partners. We appreciate it.
Now you have to help.
Okay, first of all, we're going to break in a minute for about 15 minutes. We're running a little bit behind. Apologies for that, but we got two amazing sessions coming up. One in this room, which is about how to remodel your radio and TV news broadcasts. And in the next room, for all reporters, budding reporters, and anybody who's interested in investigative news, how to be a better investigator and how to do